Zora Neale Hurston was perhaps the first Black female anthropologist, and although she was highly scrutinized and otherwise unrecognized during her time, she has since been referred to as the mother of the Harlem Renaissance. The path she tread was quite unheard of for an African American woman at the time, and her contributions to the movement have continued to be praised into the 21st century. Hurston's works highlight the cultural pride that African Americans spread during the Harlem Renaissance, a period in which Black literature and art, particularly in New York City, blossomed. The Harlem Renaissance was a revival of the culture and traditions which had long been renounced by mainstream audiences. The movement was spurred on by the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North, and it would significantly contribute to the civil rights movement that followed closely behind. Zora Neale Hurston was born in Eastonville, Florida in 1891, although she reported various different years during her career to serve her into getting into school and finding work. Eastonville was an all-Black town in Florida where Hurston grew up surrounded by African American pride. She lived there until her mother passed in 1904. Then she decided to make the move north and proceeded to attend school at Howard University, Barnard, then Columbia, where she studied anthropology. In her early years of anthropological study, she traveled to her hometown of Eastonville and researched hoodoo, a set of spiritual practices and beliefs created by slaves in the American South. Here, she also became a folklorist. She immersed herself in Black culture and recounted the stories in the Journal of American Folklore and her folk collection, Mules and Men. She further immersed herself in voodoo in Jamaica and Haiti. It is said that she was an active participant in even the most extremist practices, which are detailed in her first-hand account, Tell My Horse. Although she is known primarily as an author and journalist, she was also perhaps the first Black woman to be a filmmaker. She captured various motion pictures during her fieldwork, one of the most notable being that of Cujo Lewis, the last survivor of the last ship known to have brought slaves to the States. She documented his story in Barracoon, the story of the last Black cargo, a detailed and quite disturbing account of the atrocities of the transatlantic slave trade. It was published in 2018, almost 9 decades after it was written. Hurston began her literary career by publishing short stories which received little commercial success during her time. However, her piece Sweat, a story about a washerwoman in an abusive marriage, has since been acclaimed for its depiction of race relations and sexism in the South post-slavery. She also worked with Langston Hughes to create a play exclusively for African Americans, free of the stereotypes which were practically universal in drama at that time, and another of the same type which made it to Broadway. She also contributed to the highly controversial publication Fire, which discussed themes of homosexuality, interracial relationships, promiscuity, and prostitution, a stark contrast to what was considered acceptable journalism at the time, and a bold statement against shaming conservative values. Many of her works were based on her research, her most renowned being Their Eyes Were Watching God, a novel centered around a young woman's life and romances. The novel initially was not received well. However, it has become a classic in academia for its real and raw portrayal of an African American woman in the South. Like many of Hurston's other works, Their Eyes Were Watching God was written in colloquial vernacular based on her experience and studies, though it was widely criticized in her time. It provided an insight into a Black woman's experience of intersectionality, a term which was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. Crenshaw referred to the concept as a lens through which you can see where power intersects. In the case of a Black woman, a lack thereof. Black women in 1920s America also experienced what we know today as structural violence. Paul Farmer refers to this as the experience of people who live in poverty or are marginalized by racism, gender inequality, or a noxious mix of all of the above. As written in dialogue in Hurston's bestseller, Their Eyes Were Watching God, the Black woman is the mule of the world because the white man throw down the load to the Black man, who in turn hands it to his women folks. All her life, Hurston fought to have her voice heard, fought to get the education and the funding to do the work she wanted the world to see. However, in a cruel twist of fate, Hurston fell victim to the structural violence she so boldly renounced. She died in relative anonymity. Her books had gone out of print, and she moved back to Florida to become the impoverished and oppressed white family's maid she had written about. While Hurston received limited mainstream praise during her lifetime, her works were rediscovered during the 70s and 80s when Black literature began to garner attention in the academic world, and women's and Afro-American studies grew. Alice Walker, author of the Pulitzer Prize winner The Color Purple, discovered Hurston's work in the 70s, and she became an inspiration for Walker. Walker traveled to the segregated cemetery in Eastonville to give her a gravestone, which deems her a genius of the South. Hurston has been quoted saying, "If you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it." Hurston broke this silence for African Americans in the early Jim Crow era. She provided a voice for the voiceless, and despite criticism, spoke pain into purpose.